Soundstripe.
Oh, we're still cleaning off the dirt from the first episode, Griff. We've gotten a ton of response, and we're back for episode 2, our second week of Exit Philosophy. And I'm getting more used to this than I think I ever have before. It's good to see your face.
Yeah, nice to see you, Scotty. And it's a great thing about baseball. You play every day. We got new things to talk about every week, and I'm going to really enjoy this. I love this.
Good. So let's not waste any time pumping the brand, right? You're at griffsthepitch.com. People can get your work on Substack. If they feel like throwing one of those magnetic stripes down and running a little money your way, they'll get the entirety of your content over the course of the baseball season at griffsthepitch.com. I am a subscriber, Griff, and I'm loving it. And at some point, we will pick apart your MLB rankings, because you do those on a weekly basis.
Yeah, do those on a weekly basis, do a column. I'm going to start back into interviews, the conversations with players, former players. I'm planning on having Darren Fletcher this week or early next week, and the ones with Moises Alou, that was really fun. And so we're going to keep that up, and the content, as you said, is steady and consistent, and that's the key.
Yeah, we've had really good engagement on Twitter and social media in general this week, and we really appreciate you chiming in where you can. You can get Griff on Twitter at RichGriffBaseball, and you can get me at Scotty Mac Thinks, which I think you're seeing if you're watching us on YouTube, but we got to remember there are people listening through Apple and Spotify, etc. At Rich Griff Baseball, at Scotty Mac Thinks, and we want to become as interactive as possible on this podcast. Hashtag AskEP, ASKEP. If you have any questions that you want us to deal with, any topics you want us to deal with in the next episode, future episodes, hashtag AskEP, and send that to one or both of at Rich Griffin Baseball or at Scotty Mac Thinks. So this Blue Jays team, Griff, is, they're nothing if not entertaining. And they, as we sit here right now on Monday morning, May the 15th, are heading into a huge 4-game home series with the New York Yankees, having just come off a massive 3-game sweep of the Atlanta Braves. And Alex Anthopoulos has put together a really, really good team there in Atlanta. So to get the Braves into the Rogers Center and take all 3 games, the first 2 in absolute classic fashion, including the Blue Jays' first complete game shutout by a starting pitcher in 6 years, Chris Bassett going clean on Friday night, and culminating with whatever the hell that was yesterday.
Yeah, it's funny how baseball being an everyday game, you get the roller coaster effect. I think the last 4 series heading into the Yankee series were all sweeps. 2-4 and 2 against. And the other thing that is interesting is how fan bases pick apart their own home team because they see them every day. Familiarity, familiarity breeds contempt. It's like making a marriage fresh by going on road trips with the Expos is half your life, But there is something to be said about the Braves fan base looking at that series and just pulling their hair out about how bad that team can be when, in fact, they are an excellent team. They're still an excellent team. You look at their overall record, and they're as competitive as anybody. On my power rankings, unfortunately for the Braves, I'm going to have to move the Rays ahead of them. I've had the Braves up there because the Rays hadn't really played within the division as much as I thought that would make them the best team in baseball. But right now, the Rays are just amazingly keeping it up, even though they lose players like Rasmussen. And I just don't think they'll be able to do it the whole season because we've talked about it before, Scotty, the depth of payroll keeps the Yankees and Dodgers and other teams with big payrolls, keeps them in it even through injuries, because they're paying their bench like they're starters, and the Rays definitely can't do that. But it's interesting. It's the Jays are showing what they can do. They're showing what they can do in the new facility, or the new dimensions, and I think it's been great.
Yeah, and to your point about fan bases locking in on their own team, and as we've said, I mean, we are known for our Blue Jays coverage, so we will be Blue Jays dominant when we're talking about current baseball. We'll veer. I mean, Shohei Ohtani. There are going to be a ton of other really interesting stories as we move deeper into the summer months and toward the trade deadline. But we'll stick predominantly with the Blue Jays when we discuss current stuff. To your point about fans honing in on their own home team, like Austin Riley rumbles through town, Griff, this weekend, and he's a below average league hitter right now. He's got a sub 300 on base percentage. He's one of the young Atlanta Braves core that is signed very, 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 very long term with the likes of Acuna and Ozzie Albies, et cetera, et cetera. And I would imagine that that's bothersome to Braves fans at this point, in the very same way that the performance so far of somebody like George Springer has been bothersome to Blue Jays fans. We know that he has had up and down issues with his health over the first 2 years of his contract. We know he's in the third year of a 6-year deal, and this year has not gone according to plan, which takes us to Sunday's game. So again, I'm going to timestamp this because you may be listening well into the Yankees series or beyond when you finally stick us in your AirPods. But we are talking on Monday morning, May the 15th, after the Braves sweep, or the sweep of the Braves, and before the Yankees series. And for me, Griff, Sunday's game, it was Danny Jansen's walk-off 2-run single with 2 outs and the bases loaded in the bottom of the ninth that secured the 6-5 victory. Sunday's game was a complete debacle. It was a complete mess for both teams. Atlanta had a lot of issues defensively. It's like they weren't getting very good reads on shallow fly balls to the outfield. There were a couple of collisions. We can debate whether there's a more physical or a more mental component to that. There were 3 occasions where the Blue Jays did not hustle on the base paths in Sunday's game. George Springer was guilty of it on a 2-out shallow fly ball. He was on first base in the bottom of the first inning. He could have scored if he was hustling off of contact. He ended up at third. The Jays did not score. And later on, Bo Bichette hit a lazy fly ball into no man's land in shallow right field. He thought it was going to be caught off the bat, so he lollygagged to first. The ball falls in. He's on first base. And then he decides, I'm going to try for second. Dead duck. And then Vladimir Guerrero Jr. turned a potential double into a single by not hustling out of the batter's box in the bottom of the ninth. It didn't end up mattering, though, because the Jays ended up putting the rally together that won the game. These, to me, are the things you can control. Starting pitcher may not have it someday. Your offense may go dry for 3 or 4 games in a row. If you're George Springer and you've been well below a league average hitter all season long, waiting to come out of your funk, and you are a character player like George Springer is, what can you control as a 30-plus-year-old ball player still playing on what is predominantly a young baseball team? You can control the example that you are setting. And that tone that George Springer set in the bottom of the first inning, Griff, I doubt we see that again from him this year, because I think for a guy like Springer, one reminder's enough.
Yeah, I think that the Springer issue is the one that's the most concerning. He went 5 for 5 on opening day, and everybody goes, George Springer's back. But I don't think he hit one ball on that 5 for 5 harder than 82 miles an hour. Mm-hmm. And I know exit velocity is overrated, but that should have been concerning, or an indicator that all is not right with George yet. So I think he's been dealing with that all season, and then it comes to a head against the Braves. He He's on first base. There's a fly ball, and he has a chance to show his teammates that at the age of 30, that he still has what it takes to lead, to hustle, to be the leadoff hitter, and to score from first base. And in the first inning, with a chance to sweep, I've always felt like this team has not proven, this Blue Jays team has not yet proven that it has a killer instinct to sweep series when they need to. They were 6-12 with a chance to sweep a 3-game series or longer in 2022, and they're keeping up. They've swept a couple, but that was a lucky one on Sunday against the Braves. He needs to be the guy. If he's going to bat leadoff, if he's going to show off the field in the dugout, his personality with his teammates, then he's also got to show a winning personality on the field. And he didn't do that. And so that, to me, of the three items that you mentioned, was the most egregious.
Yeah. And I feel the same way as you do about Springer. And I take it back to last year when I was probably nauseating at some point on Twitter in yelling and screaming for Bo Bichette to be taken out of the 2 spot. And that didn't happen until after Charlie Montoyo was fired, and John Schneider, who had the interim tag at the time, took a couple of looks and thought, okay, we got to drop Bo down. Now, Bo was hitting 2 by the end of the year again because he was en fuego, came around, and Bo is absolutely full value for being the 2 hitter on this team this year. George Springer, it's the same thing. Just because you've been a leadoff hitter for the majority of your career doesn't mean that a well sub 300 on base percentage and a well sub 100 plus OPS should keep you in the leadoff spot.
I think exactly that. I mean, Charlie Montoyo used to say, when the question came up about Springer coming back from injury, would he go right back into the leadoff spot? Charlie would always say, well, we signed him as the best leadoff hitter in the American League, so yes, he's going right back in. And then often he would struggle to come back and to find himself. Why can that not be done further down in the batting order? I know, looking for a leadoff man in that group, I would say that Dalton Varsho might be that guy. He's swinging the bat better. He made the adjustment. Yeah. He hits home runs, but so does George. He's not necessarily a power hitter, has the ability to steal bases. I think George, at this stage of his career, has to dial down in terms of the speed game. We saw that on Sunday. That's what we're talking about. But in terms of stealing bases, and Varsho might be that guy for a while until maybe like Bo last year, George catches fire again and then earns that spot to go back in. It's not divine right when you're trying to win division, the best division in baseball, 47 games above 500 at this point. You got to be better than, we're hoping down the road that he'll re-find what he had.
Man, it's crazy, eh? That when you look at the standings on MLB.com, it goes AL East, AL Central, AL West, downward through the National League. 1 through 10, AL East, all the way down to the bottom of the AL Central, is in order of record. Like the Yankees and the Red Sox have been trading places in last place in the American League East, and they're right there with the AL Central leading Minnesota Twins.
Yeah, through the weekend, like I was saying, the AL East was 47 combined games above 500. The next best division was the AL or the NL East, that was 2 games above, and then the NL West was playing exactly at 500. So that's a huge divide between the AL East, and anybody who says that doesn't make a difference in terms of competitiveness and won-loss record. And when the Jays were in 4th place in that division, people going, oh, it's a 4th place team. Come on, give me a break.
Right. Yeah. And some people still grouse about 30 years ago when the Jays chose to stay in the American League East, when realignment first kicked in and the wild cards became a thing. 1995 was actually the first wild card season. It was supposed to be 1994, but we know that the strike wiped out the final 2 months of the season and the playoffs. And Griff, you may still be the lead PR guy for the Montreal Expos today.
Oh yeah,
that damn strike hadn't happened. right?
Be a new stadium downtown. It would have been right
Oh,
down the hill from the Bell Center,
yeah.
and business people would have their private suites in a 38,000 seat stadium. They'd walk down the hill from work, and the sun would be setting over the left field stands. Oh, it would have been great.
Geez, I
But
mean,
no, but
you're
no.
if you're an artist, you should paint a picture of what you just described and stick it on the wall behind you. I'd love to stare at that. I'm envisioning that. But revisionist history is a thing, Griff, and let's just quickly go back to that time, because people are like, well, the Jays would be leading the AL Central right now, or they'd be right there with atop the National League Central, or right there with the Dodgers in the West or whatever, and they wouldn't have all these other teams around them. I mean, let's just look at the history of this. When these decisions were made, the Toronto Blue Jays were owned by Labatt Brewing, at least majority ownership, Labatt Brewing. They were coming off of a World Series championship, soon to be back-to-back World Series championships. They had the highest payroll in Major League Baseball. George Steinbrenner and the New York Yankees were right at the tail end, unbeknownst to anybody, but right at the tail end of a decade plus of darkness. Jeter was about to come along. Bernie Williams had just arrived. And then the Yankees really started spending money and winning the World Series. Nobody necessarily could have foreseen that. So the Blue Jays had the best ownership in baseball, had a couple of World Series titles consecutively, and had the highest payroll. It wasn't the fact that they chose to stay in the American League East that crushed our souls for 2 decades, starting in the late 1990s. The pivotal moment for the Toronto Blue Jays was the purchase of Labatt by what was then known as Interbrew, a Belgian beer company conglomerate that had absolutely no interest in owning a baseball team, because it didn't essentially know what baseball was and didn't understand the value to its brand in Canada. And that's when things started to pare down. So as the Yankees and the Red Sox, who were always trying to keep up with the Yankees, as the Yankees and Red Sox are gearing up, the Toronto Blue Jays, under different ownership, because Interbrew, as it was known at the time, it isn't anymore, Interbrew had purchased Labatt. And that's when the change happened. It wasn't that, it was the American League East versus the American League Central. If the ownership of the late 80s and early 1990s was still in place in the late 90s and through the 2000s, it would not surprise me, hindsight's always 2020, but it would not surprise me if the Blue Jays would have been neck and neck and neck, as the case may be, with the Yankees and Red Sox.
Well, I think that definitely it would have been a mistake to switch divisions just because of not wanting to compete against the Red Sox and the Yankees. I mean, over those years since the last Blue Jays World Series and through the down times, and now back into the, from 2015 on, where the Jays are no longer considered a medium-sized market or even a small market, which they were at one point. The rivalries that they've had with the Yankees and the Red Sox, that is, fills the stadium whenever they come to town, and allows Blue Jays fans to go on the road. And it's become a thing now, going on the road and seeing all the Blue Jays jerseys in the stands. And it doesn't matter where. It helps if it's close to the Canadian border, like Detroit, Cleveland, Seattle in particular, Minnesota. But those rivalries that they've had, and the need to compete, the need to build a really championship team, has been much better for this franchise than going into a division with Detroit and Cleveland and Pittsburgh or whoever they would have realigned at that point. It's been far better to stay and be competitive and lose most of the time. But you have to beat those teams anyway if you're going to win the World Series. I mean, you have to beat them. And to have that many games played against quality opponents at Rogers Center and then go up to their ballparks and compete has made this franchise try harder and be better.
We're interactive here on Exit Philosophy. You can get Griff on Twitter at Rich Griff Baseball, and you can get me on Twitter at Scotty Mac Thinks. And you're saying to yourself, if you're watching us on YouTube, I can see that on the screen. So why the hell are you telling me? Well, we also have listeners listening on Apple and Spotify. And Griff, I hope that somebody is hearing me say this right now, listening on Google Podcasts, because if it takes to the end of my life to figure out how to get this thing on Google, I'm going to do it. You've been great about reaching out to us and sort of alerting us to where there are holes in our distribution and et cetera. We are working on that. But if you're watching on YouTube, you're looking at Griff, you're looking at me, and you're not saying to yourself that these are two technologically sound human beings. So we're working on it, and we are ramping up. And a reminder, you can get to all of Griff's content on griffsthepitch.com. griffsthepitch.com. One
more comment about the Blue Jays and the AL East.
Yep.
I remember in Las Vegas at the winter meetings under the previous ownership, the philosophy was that when the fans start coming back into the stadium, we'll start to spend money. And I remember writing columns and going, that's ridiculous. This is major professional sports. That's not the way that operates. It's not like selling beer. Like you need to go out and spend money to attract people. And at a certain point, it might have been 2013, they decided that was the way they needed to go. 2015, Alex Anthopoulos at the deadline went out and made significant moves to bring quality players in. And for the rest of that season, the stadium was filled. The stadium was jumping. And since then, that philosophy has changed, thank God, because that was killing them back in the early zeros when JP Ricciardi was there.
Well, hold on a second. Are you advocating for the notion of investing money with the expectation of getting a return on that investment as opposed to just shredding it down and showing the bean counters, look at what I did?
Well, they
my
found that
sucks. My
Rogers
product sucks.
Rogers has found that out because of the TV ratings, which regularly exceed the Yes Network and the Yankees Network, because the Jays are going coast to coast. But there can't be a dollar figure, or I'm sure there is, but they're not going to give it publicly a dollar figure on what that means to Rogers and the Rogers Network.
No question. And the Jays have shown a willingness to spend money and a willingness to be serious about competing. And as we discussed in our last episode, and I'm sure we'll discuss in the future, Vladimir Guerrero is next up. Bo Bichette eventually, although things are settled with him now, I would assume for the next couple of winters, but that's going to be a conversation that isn't too far down the road. Matt Chapman is a more immediate concern, but he's got to fit in to the bigger picture because he is not as good a player as he is, and as great a start as he is off to, he is not the priority in terms of the long-term view of this team. He fits if he fits, and that's a two-way street. The Jays have to fit him and the money and the years, and he's got to fit into what the Jays are looking to do as they prioritize keeping their young players.
And as we began to discuss last week, the Chapman situation is imminent. It's coming up at the end of this season. Scott Boras is his agent. Scott Boras takes his players to free agency, so there won't be any late season signing of Matt Chapman to a multi-year deal, which sets it up for the Blue Jays to spend the rest of this season trying to figure out how much they can afford to give or how much they need to give to Vladimir Guerrero Jr., because that's the key before you get to Matt Chapman, is that you've got, as you mentioned earlier, you've got Bo tied up for the next 3 years. So at least he's got that contract. But once you get Vlad, and if you go to Chapman and manage to sign him, then you've got something to work with Bo's people in terms of where he could fit in. The thing about the Blue Jays now is that, they've focused so much on starting pitching, and God bless them, it's working out. There's only been 5 starters have handled every game that the Blue Jays have faced. And the bottom 2 in the rotation, Barrios and Kikuchi, have been much better than they were a season ago. So it's a solid 5-man rotation. 4 of the top salaries for 2023 on this Blue Jays team are starting pitchers. So that's where the priority has been. Now they're going to turn their attention to their everyday position players, and let's see what they can do.
And Griff, far be it for me to crap on your Kikuchi take. And I know you have a new hip. I know you have a new hip. So maybe you can limbo under the bar that Kikuchi set last year. I will say, and he has been better, but he has allowed 11 home runs so far this season. I mean, that's through Sunday's start against the Braves.
I like Dan Schulman and Buck Martinez saying, well, you know, he's given up 11 home runs because he throws the ball hard.
Yeah,
there's a lot of guys throw the ball hard.
Yeah, hey, you know what? There's a laundry list of things I wish I had that I don't, Griff. And the ability to dot, that look on your face says you've got two or three darts you could throw right at me right now. One of the things I don't have the ability to do that I would like to have the ability to do is dot 96, throw 96 on the corners with my left arm. And so to me with Kikuchi, it's typically about location, right? It's number one, it's about location. And number two, it's about the willingness to trust that fastball and not get into the off speed stuff where you end up hanging one in certain counts. It's just, to me with him, it's a confidence thing. It's a confidence thing first.
And the same thing that you're talking about with Kikuchi, the consistency to be able to do that and not throw those pitches that end up in the seats. That was a situation where they got away with it on Sunday against the Braves. I mean, that was a game they should not have won the way they played, the way he pitched. And they did. They came back and won that game. And it's the same way that Berríos got by last year. And people always downplay the fact that the Jays were 23-9 in Berríos 32 starts last year. And they go, he's got to be much better with his numbers. Well, wait a second. The bottom line in the standings every day when you look online is wins and losses for the team. So to say, well, this season will be saved if Berríos' numbers are better, the only number that really counted in the standings was his 23-9 record in the 32 games that he started. I don't know how it happened. They averaged like 8, 9, 10 runs in his wins. but you know, you can't. They needed Kikuchi to come back and be that type of sort of roller coaster guy, but with a winning record. And so far, so good.
Right.
11 home runs in. 11 home runs. I remember and so here I go off the top of my head where I could be off on this because I don't have a memory for anything anymore. But I remember looking it up some point last August because that was a big talking point on Twitter that Jose Berríos was actually having a good year. And I was like, what? Because the ERA plus, the hard hit ball rate, the strikeouts were down per 9, the walks per 9 were up. There was nothing, but he was good 75% of the time. And just when he was bad 25% of the time, he was really, really, really bad. And I went through and I counted the number of games the Blue Jays won where Berríos had given up 5 or more earned runs. And at that point, it was numbering 3, 4, or 5. And I did the same thing for Alek Manoah, who spent most of last year being dominant, and the number was 0. And the run support generally for Alek. Now, there wasn't 3, 4, 5 games where Alek did give up 5 earned runs. But if he did, they lost. So yeah, it had a lot to do, I think, with the bats. The bar was set low, but if you're a 4 and a 5 in the rotation, you really just want to make sure you're eating innings. And if you're throwing 5, 5 and a third, 5 and 2/3, get to 6, that by the time you come out of the game, your team is still in it. That you're not down 5, 6, 8 runs and it's over. That goes back to our earlier conversation here in that we're seeing the Blue Jays 4 and 5 starters every 5 days, and you can pick it apart. You can say that, they got to improve. But if you look at the other 29 teams and look at their 4 and 5 starters, you've got guys with 5 point something ERAs. You got guys with 1.8 whips. I mean, it's not any better anywhere else. Well, there's 30 teams needing 6, 7 starting pitchers. So that's a lot of starting pitchers, and you're not going to have consistent quality up and down. I think the Jays are ahead of the game in that regard.
And that's a fair point, because I mean, the Braves on Sunday threw Colin McHugh, and he was on a limit. Like they were hoping to get 3 innings max out of him. Right. And I know that there had been rumors about that game Sunday possibly being Mike Soroka's return after a 2+ year absence. And that hasn't happened yet. And we're certainly rooting for that. And like the Manoah situation. And again, we are talking on Monday morning, May the 15th. So Alec is going to pitch, if we're sitting here right now, not necessarily when you're listening, but as we're sitting here, Alec is to pitch game 1 of the Yankees series at Rogers Center tonight, Monday night, May the 15th. And we're still waiting for him, Griff, to turn a corner. There's been a ton of talk about the slider. And I think this poor guy right now is deep in his own head. And I've just started looking for it. It feels like it's almost every pitch where on his follow through, the first thing he's doing is looking down at the mound to see, this is what I think he's doing, to see where his foot landed. This is a guy right now who is battling one of the necessary things for a pitcher, which is the ability to repeat your delivery, pitch in and pitch out. And I just don't think he's got any clue right now, deep in his own head, Griff, about where that pitch is going and where that foot's going to land, pitch in and pitch out.
Well, when the ball leaves his hand on some of those sliders, they're not competitive. We see that on television. We see that at the game. And he can see it. He's the first person to see it when it leaves his hand. So he knows it's not competitive, and that's when his head goes down, because in the past, the last couple of seasons, those pitches have started on the plate, broken away, and induced a lot of players to swing and miss at a ball not in the zone. But if he's not even teasing players to swing and at those offerings, then he's putting himself into fastball counts. One of my thoughts is that maybe Danny Jansen should take over behind the plate from Alejandro Kirk, because to me, Kirk, and I've coached baseball at same age group, not the same talent, same age groups, but a lot of catchers, when they're calling a game, call a game to get themselves out. Like, if I'm at the plate, what would get me out in this situation? Well, it'd be a slider, because I'm a dead fastball hitter. I can hit any fastball, any speed, and hit a line drive. So I'm going to throw myself a slider. And now that Manoah is not commanding that slider, maybe it's time, like we talked about, putting George Springer down in the lineup until he refines his groove. Maybe we change up the catcher on Manoah until he reestablishes himself of fastball, slider, command, and then gets back at it.
Right. And it's not like Alejandro Kirk is tearing the cover off the ball offensively right now, and you'd 100% miss his bat. Although it was the summer months last year where he really heated up, because people don't think about this. He got off to a slow start the first 6 weeks offensively last year. So you assume and you hope that he will get hot. I noticed the same things, and I think Jordan Romano's ERA is far worse when Alejandro Kirk is catching him than when Danny Jansen is catching him. Now, that's a different thing, Griff, because you can't control.
Correct,
yeah, you can't control. You're not starting a catcher on a given day in anticipation of Jordan Romano coming into a game or not coming into a game. But when Romano becomes too slider reliant for me, it's typically when Kirk is catching him, number one, and number two, and I think there's a time and a place for a longer conversation about this. You know, Jordan has humped it up to 98 a little more consistently lately, but he's typically been sitting 96. And I think he becomes too slider reliant sometimes because he just doesn't get enough swing and miss on his fastball because it's not hard enough.
We'll just put it this way: there will not be a Kirk Romano bobblehead doll this year. We'll just leave it at that. Yeah, it's like whatever.
Hands,
But maybe the more that Kirk struggles at the plate, struggles hitting the fastball, maybe he'll start calling more fastballs because he's looking for something that can get him out. Right now, it's almost everything.
How many managers did you? Well, let's just do the totality of it. How many managers have you dealt with? Whether you've been a PR guy, because we know you did that for more than 20 years with the Expos. You wrote your baseball column for the Toronto Star for more than 20 years. You worked with Charlie Montoyo, and at the back half of last year, John Schneider, in your 4-year tenure as the Blue Jays PR head. How many managers have you worked with, dealt with through your half century in baseball?
That's funny because I always wondered about that. So I put a list together, and if you don't mind, if you'll just humor me, I'm going to read down the list. 19 managers, okay. 19 major league managers that I've worked with or covered, and they're all different. We got Gene Mauch, Carl Keel, Charlie Fox, Dick Williams, Jim Fanning, Bill Verdon, Buck Rogers, Tom Reynolds, Felipe Alou, Cito Gaston, Mel Queen for 5 days, Tim Johnson, Jim Fregosi, Buck Martinez, Carlos Tosca, John Gibbons, John Farrell, Charlie Montoyo, and John Schneider. So 19.
Wow.
So
just to give you context before we jump in on that, Griff, Buck Rogers is the first Expos manager I remember. And you didn't list Bobby Cox because you weren't covering the Blue Jays at the time, but the two managers of the two Canadian baseball teams when I started to form memories at 5 or 6 years old in the mid 1980s were Bobby Cox here in Toronto, and then he quickly left, we know, and Jimmy Williams took over, and Buck Rogers. So, like, do you have an individual? We'll have to do a deeper dive into this, come up with some kind of list, but do you have an individual who stands out to you? Gene Mauch is a name I remember. He was an older guy when I remember him, and he was managing the Angels, which I think was his last stop.
Yeah, Gene Mauch was, like I read off that list, was the first manager that I worked with, and I was 19 years old, and he was the little general. He had come from the Phillies, where in 1964 they had blown the National League pennant because he went to a 2-man rotation down the stretch. He was a genius in terms of strategy, and I borrowed more from him when I started coaching my two boys, not at the same time but consecutively. I borrowed more from him because whenever this was a skill that he had. Whenever he needed a run, he could find a run. Whenever he needed 5 runs, he could find a run. He was always playing for that one run.
Small ball.
And that's why I think he lost 100 games maybe 2 or 3 times with the Expos, but he was, in terms of strategy, he was a genius, in just terms of taking bad players. He could make bad teams mediocre and good teams mediocre, but for the time, he was perfect for that role, for that team, from the expansion 69 team till he was let go at the end of the 75 season. But I remember going down to the clubhouse between games of the doubleheaders, and there were always a lot of doubleheaders. So I'd be going down to the clubhouse because I had to get the lineup for the second game, hoping that they win the first game. Because if you go in to his office and say, Mr. Mauch, do you have a lineup for the second game? The food table has already been flipped. and like, he doesn't want to play anybody in that room because they all suck.
Right.
And so I got used to that, but it was a unique experience. There was one time in, I think it was 1972, the year before I started, with the Expos. I heard stories about this when I got there, and I was at the game when it happened, but Steve Carlton hit Tim Foley, who was exactly the same as Gene Mauch in terms of temperament and sometimes being an a-hole. But Tim Foley was hit by Steve Carlton, and he started staggering to the mound. I think he was hitting the head. He's staggering to the mound after Carlton. Gene Mauch led the charge from the dugout, and they got to the mound at the same time, and there were fists flying. There was a pile of players. There was no TV, so nobody could really get replays and details on it. But all we know is that Gene Mauch came out of that pile bleeding. His glasses were broken, and he's staggering towards the clubhouse because he's a mess. And the suspicion was that the fists were flying in that pile. He was with Steve Carlton because he had managed the Phillies not too many years earlier. But the suspicion was that there were Expos fists flying at Gene Mauch's head at the same time. It's more than a suspicion, because I think it was Ron Hunt asked the photographers who were at the game if they had photos of the pile. And the next day when they had a team meeting in the clubhouse, he had pictures, he had still photos of the fight. And he challenged all of his teammates. He said, I know that you didn't help Gene. I know because I have pictures on my locker. Go look at my pictures on my locker and see where you were. And if that happens again, I'm going to kick the shit out of you. So that was Gene Mauch. He was a genius, but it was tough to follow him into battle.
Yeah, that was Gene Mauch, and that wouldn't necessarily play in 2023. And by not necessarily, I don't think it would play at all. As you were talking about the small ball, you're like, well, you can make a bad team mediocre, and you can make a good team mediocre. And I'm envisioning like you're down 5, bottom of the 8th inning at Jerry Park, leadoff double. Now's the time to drop a bunt down to get that guy to third. Like, well, I'm probably exaggerating, but maybe not.
No, Gene would do that if he thought it was the best chance for a bad player to contribute. Like, he's not going to go, well, he's got like a 0.9% chance of getting a base hit here. He go, I know he can lay down a bunt, so he's laying one down. Maybe they'll mess it up and he'll get on base. I remember standing on the field in '86. You talked about that era, but standing on the field at Shea Stadium in '86 with Dave Van Horn. It was during batting practice for the Mets during the championship series, and the Angels game was on the board, and it was in the 8th inning. And Gary Lucas, Gene Mauch brought Gary Lucas into the game, left-hander who had played for the Expos previously. And I looked at Dave, and Dave looked at me, and we both shook our heads. This isn't going to go well, because Gary Lucas gave it up, and then Donnie Moore came in and gave up the huge winning home run, I think it was. Yeah. But Gary Lucas in Houston the year before, under Buck Rogers, had a scrum with the media after a game where he gave it up, and he said that the reason that he gave it up to the Astros was because he had taken his kids on the roller coaster at Astro World. And I said, this guy is never going to be a winner. And turns out I was right.
You were right. So May the 14th was this past Sunday, and it was Mother's Day as we're sitting here talking on Monday, May the 15th. But May the 14th of 1998 was a huge day culturally in our world. Frank Sinatra passed away. So we just marked the 25th anniversary of Frank Sinatra's death, and you and I have left the Yankee Stadium press box after a game enough times to be singing New York, New York to ourselves right now. I know you're singing it, Griff. I know you're singing it lyric by lyric in your own head. But May the 14th, 1998 was also the series finale of Seinfeld. And we are not going to digress on a Blue Jays and baseball centered podcast debating the quality of that series finale. But as we know, Jerry Seinfeld is a huge baseball fan. I think he's even made some comment in the past about what retirement would look like for him would just be going to a baseball game every day. Huge baseball fan. huge New York Mets fan. And of course, during the series, George Costanza, Ruth, Gehrig, DiMaggio, Mantle, Costanza? George Costanza went to work for George Steinbrenner and the New York Yankees. So there was a ton of baseball content in what many, including me, believe to be the greatest sitcom that has ever been made. Do you, Griff, have a favorite baseball-related moment from that series?
Oh, yeah, I thought about it, and it's definitely the Keith Hernandez appearance, where they reenact the grassy knoll with the Kennedy, and it's they're coming out of Shea Stadium, and either Kramer or Newman gets hit by a loogie from an unknown source, and they blame Keith Hernandez. That was brilliant. And I think that those years that had George working for the Yankees were the best. I mean, not just for baseball fans, but in terms of plot lines and bringing history into it. But you're the guy, so talk about that.
Well, just on yours, the Magic Loogie, right? There was Roger McDowell behind the bush or the small tree, and Newman turns and says, "Nice game, pretty boy." And then the Magic Loogie flies, and everybody thought it was Keith Hernandez, who Jerry sort of ended up with a man crush on, because that was a double episode. But I think it was Roger McDowell, Keith's Mets bullpen teammate, who was the proprietor of the Magic Loogie.
Just an aside there, Roger McDowell's younger brother, in fact, worked for me in West Palm Beach at spring training. He was from Florida, and he would bring cases of Labatt 50 up the ramp to the press box so that I could work after games. So
there you go.
My Roger McDowell connection.
Love that. Love that. My favorite is, well, I have so many, but I'll just pick one. George ends up leaving his car parked in the parking lot at Yankee Stadium. Just he never moves it, because he realizes that if he keeps it there, it'll look like he is the first employee into the office every day and the last to leave. And of course, the pigeons and the birds start crapping all over the car, so it becomes really obvious that nobody's been driving this, and nobody can find George, and so people think George is dead. So Steinbrenner goes to Queens to Frank and Estelle, George's parents' house, and sits down in their living room, and George is dead. And Estelle is sort of beside herself, can't really believe it. And there's Jerry Stiller, Frank Costanza. "What the hell did you trade Jay Buhner for? He's got a cannon for an arm, a big right-handed bat, blah, 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 blah." And there's Larry David's voice playing playing Steinbrenner, because we never actually saw Steinbrenner's face in the series, but it was Larry David's voice. My scouts kept saying, "Got to have Ken Phelps, got to have Ken Phelps." Because Jay Buhner was a Yankees prospect who was traded to the Mariners, and Buhner was a big part of those mid to late 90s Mariners teams that were really, really good, with Griffey Jr. and A-Rod and Randy Johnson, etc. And Ken Phelps was a left-handed bat whose best days were behind him. And so I just thought that was an absolute classic line, and it was probably something Larry David felt strongly about, which is why it was written in and performed so well.
Did Jerry Stiller ever win an Emmy for supporting actor? Because he was the best support comedy actor in television history, I think.
Yeah, we'd have to go look that up, because he had a role in King of Queens after Seinfeld.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, a similar character.
Yeah. So, but just awesome. There are so many, and you're gonna get that too. Like, I might devolve into like a Cosmo Kramer giddy up. I used to do that in high school. It tells you how normal I was. But it was en vogue back in the day, because we were all waiting for Thursday night to watch the next new Seinfeld episode. Before we wrap here, Griff,
let me just get, because I don't think we finished the Sunday when we talked about George Springer. We covered him. But I think that it was important for Vlad on his base running gaff where he, in the ninth inning, with a chance to tie the game, hits a ball to the opposite field that maybe in the old ball, maybe in the old configuration, maybe even in this configuration, if the roof is closed, is out.
Right.
But the day before, he had impressed with his joie de vivre, his love of the game with that dive into second base on the double. And then he immediately the next day, within 24 hours, erases that memory with one of him trotting into first base as the ball hits the wall. And I think that Vlad at 24 years old can more be forgiven than George Springer can for what he did. But if he learns from that, if Vlad learns from that, if Bo learns from that moving forward, that's all you can hope for. And it's something that you don't need to call a clubhouse meeting as a manager or coaches. They take care of it. It's taken care of internally. I'm sure that some of the veteran players have spoken to both of them, and you could see on the field that they were both regretful of those moments. And if they happen again, I would be surprised. But let's monitor that moving forward, and hopefully we don't have to talk about it again.
Yeah, well, I think the best thing that could have happened after the game, and whether we find out whether it did or not, remains to be seen as we sit here right now on Monday, May the 15th, would be George Springer getting up in front of the team and saying, I bleeped up in the first inning, and I set the tone for a day full of bleep ups, and I'm going to hold myself to a higher standard going forward so that I can hold others in this clubhouse to a higher standard going forward. Let's commit to running out fly balls, potential home runs that might hit the wall, et cetera, et cetera. Let's commit, because a lot of this stuff, Griff, I mean, the trades of Teoscar and Lourdes, part of that was we need a little more focus.
And you know what?
Attention to detail, as John Schneider repeated often in spring training.
You know what's funny about that, Scotty, is that you put in front of the room Springer, when in fact the guy in front of the room on all big occasions is Bo. And he takes it upon himself, 24 years old.
Yeah.
Last year, 23, at the end of the season, he was the guy who had the final word in that clubhouse about coming back and finishing the job next year. So I think Springer should, but it would be Bo if it was anybody in that room, which shocks a lot of people.
Yeah, just given his age. But, we've heard a lot about his leadership. And I remember in 2019 spring training, he's 20-year-old kid. He hasn't even played a big league game yet, and just shooting the breeze with him at his locker stall a couple of times when I was down there, and just getting not just a sense of his love for the game, but just his understanding of it. And of course, he grew up in a baseball household. His dad was retired, I think, by the time that Bo would have been old enough to watch him play, but just grew up around the sport, understanding the sport, learning about the sport, living and breathing it. So, I mean, that's reflected in why there's some maturity in these young players. And I'll just add, Griff, because people were suggesting to me, a couple of people, wasn't a ton of people, but a couple of people on Twitter after Sunday's win over the Braves, that the way you send a message is by benching Vlad and Bo for the first game of the Yankees series, to which I replied, that would be the opposite of intelligence. You do not sit your two best players, the 2-3 hitters in your batting order, in the first game of a crucial division series in May against a New York Yankees team that you play 6 fewer games against, which means you slightly less control your destiny vis-a-vis the Yankees. You don't sit your 2 and 3 hitters, your two best players, in a game against the Yankees to, quote, prove a point.
The only way you might have done that is if they had followed up their gaffes with a Tyler O'Neill arrogance type thing, where you show that you don't understand what happened. You don't understand what you just did. Then maybe you might have to. But both guys, I mean, they've been around enough years since they were 20, where those in the front office and in the clubhouse know exactly how they feel and that they understand.
Yeah.
But there was one moment, just to finish up here. There was one moment with Bo when he was still in New Hampshire, and he was brought in for the winter program because he was a hot rookie, and Hazel May had them up on stage in front of a packed house of fans, January. And it was a quiz show where they were given clues by a teammate for a movie. And Bo got up and he was receiving the clues. And I forget who was giving him the clues, but the movie was Titanic. And so the clues were giant iceberg, boat hits, boat sinks, and Bo had no clue.
He wasn't born when the movie came out.
I'm going, uh-oh. But
Yeah.
like a 19-year-old in a pop culture, like a Academy Award winning movie, although maybe it shouldn't have won, but and like iceberg, big boat,
Leo DiCaprio.
Yeah, well, I think he was
Kate Winslet.
Still didn't get it.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, we can tie it back to Seinfeld. I mean, Bo's an early 98 baby, right? He was literally an infant when
God, that makes me feel old.
When Seinfeld went off the air, like literally,
yeah,
probably weighed about 10 pounds.
Now I'll be depressed all the way till we do this again next week.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to give a shout out because the Mississauga Majors hosted a baseball tournament for 13-year-olds over the weekend, Mother's Day weekend. And my friend Derek's son, who you've met before, Griff, my friend Derek's son, his name is Hunter. I went to his game on Saturday morning down on Lakeshore Promenade. He is celebrating his 13th birthday toward the end of this month of May. He went 5 innings, struck out 12, walked a couple, gave up 3 hits, all of them singles. And for the first 3+ innings, and Hunter's a left-handed pitcher, for the first 3+ innings, fair ball, foul ball, there wasn't one baseball that the opponent, Stouffville, pulled, right-handed or left-handed. Absolutely dominant, throws about 65, 66 miles per hour from a 50-foot mound, which is the equivalent of a mid-80s fastball from a 60-foot, 6-inch mound. I've known Hunter his whole life. I've watched him come up. He loves baseball. And my favorite part about it, sitting in that crowd that day, and I was sitting beside his father, Derek, was we were actually thinking, because they're at that age now, right, where they're changing speeds, changing eye line, changing location. We were actually thinking along with Hunter as he pitched. And this kid has an aptitude, man, and he loves the sport. It's a lot of fun.
Scotty, let's fill out a card with the information, and I'll give it to my son Pat, who's scouting Canada for the Blue Jays, and he can sit on that card for the next 5 years. And if it turns out, maybe you'll get a bird dog status. You know,
you got it. You got it.
All right,
well, this was a blast, Griff. Now, we promised we'd try to keep it in the 35 to 45 minute range, but the problem is you got a former radio host on one side, and you got a writer with 50 years of baseball experience on the other. So I think we're getting close to an hour here. But why stop when we're having fun? So let's put a wrap on episode 2, and we'll keep coming at you weekly here. And we want to keep pumping this thing. Griff's written work and the podcast will also be available on his website, griffsthepitch.com. We want you to be interactive with us. If there is a question you have about the Blue Jays, about the sport in general, if there's a topic you want us to cover, hashtag AskEP, Ask Exit Philosophy, hashtag AskEP, ASKEP, and fire it to our Twitter accounts, at Rich Griff Baseball and at Scotty Mac Thinks, which you can see on the screen if you're watching us on YouTube, but obviously can't if you're listening.
Perfect. I really enjoyed this, as I did the first, but we'll have new material because they do play every day, and we're paying attention. So I'm looking forward to next week, Scotty.
Yeah, big series against the Yankees for the Blue Jays this week, and then the Orioles are coming in. So by the time we're with you early next week, 7 more crucial divisional games will have been played. Have a good week.